And also, while we're sort of in this phase waiting for folks, I'll invite you if you'd like to update your name, including your pronouns. If you'd like to affiliate with any institution today, you can add that. Again, these are all options. If you haven't updated your name before, I think most of you probably have, just look for those 3 dots up in the corner of your screen. You can rename. One more minute. Hallie, did you say you disabled the waiting room?
Yes.
All right. The folks will be able to just jump on in. That's All right, well, why don't we go ahead and get started. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gwen Fernandez. I am the Pacific representative for the Museum Education Division's Development Committee, and I'd love to welcome you all to today's peer-to-peer session. Just by way of verbal description, I am a white woman with long, dark gray hair pulled back today. I'm wearing a black turtleneck and some yellow hoop earrings. I'm coming to you from my home in Phoenix, Arizona, on the ancestral lands of the Hohokam and the Akimel O'odham people. And you can see in this space kind of cluttered a bookshelf behind me, a wooden ceiling above me, and some plants and mess on my desk behind you. So with that, I just again want to thank you all for joining us for today's peer-to-peer, examining what has really changed in the museum field with some of our Viewfinder authors. Before I hand it over to our Viewfinder editors, who will introduce our panel for today, just want to offer a few housekeeping notes from NAEA. So first, just Peer2Peer is a monthly conversation series that we offer for our educator community. This is an informal session, so we really encourage conversation, questions, video on, video off, just really showing up as you are today. We are recording today's session, and it will be available on our YouTube channel very shortly, where all of our peer-to-peer sessions are archived. And lastly, if you're interested in getting more involved in NAEA, we are looking for representative elects. So I serve for the Pacific region, but we have representatives from every region, and along with the reps, there is a rep elect. So as a committee, we organize events like Peer2Peer. We work on pre-conference and conference, reviewing session proposals, awards, and other initiatives on behalf of the Museum Education Division. So if this is something you're interested in joining us, I'm going to drop a link in the chat as well as my email. The link is an interest form, so if you want to put your interest in right there, you can. If you want to learn more, please feel free to reach out, and I'll be happy to chat more with you. So with that, I want to hand things over to Hallie Scott and the rest of the Viewfinder team to introduce today's program.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to see you all. I'm Hallie Scott. I am a co-editor of Viewfinder, and I'm also the specialist for university audiences at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles. My visual description, I am a cisgendered white woman with dark brown hair. I have big gray headphones on, a black turtleneck, and I am pretending to be at the Hammer where I work, so I have green bamboo behind me, although I'm actually in Echo Park, Los Angeles, which is the ancestral home of the Tongva and Chumash peoples. And I'll pass things over to Sierra to introduce herself.
Thanks, Hallie. My name is Sierra Van Richtiger. My pronouns are she, her. My visual description is that I am a Black woman with shoulder length hair, with about dark brown shoulder length hair. I am wearing the aux cord Apple earphones, and I have a maroon beanie on. I am wearing a gray sweatshirt And behind me is a Black background with artwork on the walls. I am calling in from New Jersey, and it just is my always meeting reminder that no New Jersey slander will stand in this meeting. But I am also calling in from the ancestral lands of the Lenape people.
And because we have kind of a smaller group today, we'd love to just go around and have everybody introduce themselves and share where you're here from and maybe what drew you to come to this session. So maybe we could start with the contributors, Jason, Joe, Ashley, and Kate, and then pass it off to everybody else who's here as well. Yeah. Do you want to start us off, Ashley?
Sure. Before I jump in, I just want to say thank you to everyone at Viewfinder for this wonderful opportunity to connect with various educators from around the country. It's one of my favorite parts of my job is being able to listen and learn and connect from people all over. So thank you. I'm Ashley Corin, she, her, hers. I am the Women's History Content and Interpretation Curator at the National Portrait Gallery, as well as the Smithsonian's American Women's History Initiative. I am a Black woman. I am currently wearing glasses, and I have what they refer to as a teeny weeny afro, which is covered today by a coral wrap, which is on my head. I do want to give thanks to the Native Americans on whose ancestral land that I am sitting on, as well as the Smithsonian. And I do want to mention that you can't see it behind me, but I have a shirt that says, a Black shirt that says that men have made a lot of bad art behind me. So that is the setting that I am in at this moment. Do I need to add anything else? Okay.
That's where you got that shirt.
The National Museum of Women in the Arts, which is fabulous. And I do want to mention that unfortunately my colleague, Caitlin Blake, who is my co-author, is unable to join us today, but she sends her regards.
How about Joe?
Okay. Hi, my name is Joe McEntee, and I am an arts educator at the Smart Museum of Art. My visual description is I am a Black woman with more salt than pepper, gray hair. I'm wearing glasses. My sweater is a sort of, oh, I should have wore something black. Okay, it is a sort of rose-colored knit with orange and turquoise triangles on it. Very colorful. I am at home right now in my basement in Chicago, the Rogers Park area, which sits on ancestral Potawatomi land. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to Jason, who is the co-author, one of 6 other co-authors of the article we did for Viewfinder.
Thank you, Joe. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jason Pallas. I'm also at the Smart Museum of Art with Joe. And just to acknowledge, like she said, that we have a big group of people that helped author this article. I thought it might be nice if we acknowledge them as well. So that's, oh gosh, I hate when you have to acknowledge people. Like you're always going to forget someone, but I'm not going to. So Nicole Bond, Catherine Davis, Kathy Fitzgerald, Rita Alvarez, and Myra Palafox. I did it. Wonderful. I use he, him. I'm calling in today from the south side of Chicago, the ancestral homelands of the Council of the Three Fires. And I am a white man with increasingly salted beard going on, pink glasses, and behind me is a window in our new apartment with a very long plant. Yeah, and just doubling down on the extreme thanks for Viewfinder and NAEA for bringing this group together and giving this opportunity. So I think that kicks it to Kate, I believe.
Hello, hello. Lots of Chicago folks here on the call today. My name is Kate Swisher. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a cisgender white woman who also, again, lives in Chicago on the traditional homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, as well as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and Fox. And since we have so many Chicago folks on the call, I thought I would share a link in the chat to donate to the Chi Nations Youth Council, which is like a just fantastic group in Chicago. Just putting it there. I am an assistant exhibitions registrar at the Field Museum. So thank you for welcoming this lone registrar to your meeting of amazing educators. And for my visual description, I have pale skin, light pink glasses, dark curly chin length hair. I'm wearing a black Museums Are Not Neutral shirt, which you can barely see, and a purple sweater. And in my background, you might be able to see some wall decorations, including plastic flamingo. And you might be able to see my cat asleep on the bed in the background as well. And I'm here representing Museum Workers Speak, along with Paula Santos, who I'll introduce, or I'll pass it off to next. I joined Museum Workers Speak back in 2015 when we were first organizing a rogue session at the AAM conference to talk about labor practices in museums. And we reactivated last year, of course, around the Museum Workers Mutual Fund. So with that, I will pass it off to Paula.
Hello, everyone. It's great to see so many people from Chicago. Thankfully, I know a couple of you. So I am currently in Pilsen, which is the southwest side of Chicago. And we're doing visual descriptions, right? So I'm wearing this sort of burgundy knit dress, which you can only see a part of. I'm surrounded by books. There's a bookcase in the back. There's a filing cabinet, and I have a little bit of a window so I can see on the outside, to the outside. So I am the senior manager of learning and engagement at Intuit, the Center for Intuitive and Outsider Arts. And we're a fairly small museum that focuses on self-taught and outsider arts. And, you know, it's interesting to identify myself as that because a lot of the work that I've been doing with Kate and others, including this written article, has really been about life beyond my 9-to-5 job. You know, Museum Workers Speak is totally, I would say, a labor of complete love and devotion, I think, for everyone who's been involved. But I think that was it, right, Hallie? Do I pass it on to someone else? Sorry, I came a little bit late.
I'm actually going to take it back. I had said we'd have every single person do an introduction, but a few other people have joined. So for the sake of time, for everybody else, I would love for you to just share in the chat where you're here from and what has brought you here. And then we'll all have time to talk in the second part of our time together. So I'll just give a little bit of a background on Viewfinder and our upcoming 13th issue and what is kind of bringing us together today. And then we have some questions for our contributors. So Viewfinder is an experimental publication, focuses on museum education for NAEA's Museum Education Division. And at Viewfinder, we're really interested in the intersection between museum education and social justice. So our issues have themes that kind of focus on different questions at that intersection. And our next issue is our 13th issue, which is soon to be published. And for that issue, we really wanted to focus on the topic and kind of the question of change as a way to reflect on the past year, both in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the pandemic of systemic racism. So looking back at how much this discourse of change has kind of dominated our field in the past year, all of the calls for institutional reckoning, the uprisings in support of Black lives, the activism of Change the Museum and other social media initiatives, and then also the many proclamations and promises and kind of performative actions that museums have taken in response to those calls. So we wanted to think about this question of what has actually changed. And all of the authors in this upcoming issue, some of whom are here today, focus on the complicated question of real measurable change on both a personal level and an institutional level. And this issue 13, will be published in the next couple of weeks. So this is kind of a teaser for our upcoming issue. And then for this peer-to-peer, we wanted to gather some of the authors who contributed to that upcoming issue, but also some contributors from past issues too, so that we can kind of come together to think about this question of change and then also the process of writing about it. So for our time, we have a few opening questions that we'll pose to the authors, and then we really want it to be a conversation with you all. So we'll kind of open things up to questions from you and a conversation between all of us. So I'll turn things over to Sierra to pose a question.
Yeah. Thank you to everyone for being in attendance and to our authors for agreeing to be part of Peer-to-Peer today. So I'm actually going to start and do a little bit of a reverse and start with Kate and Paula from Museum Workers Speak to talk a little bit about the topic that you wrote about in Viewfinder.
You know, Kate and I, so it's interesting because I think as I was rereading it, I was like, this was like our manifesto of what we really thought when we were first beginning this project. And even though it was published later in the fall, it was published in September, the ideas that are in that piece were really talked over from the beginning of us talking about this mutual aid fund back in April. And there were so many people that joined our conversations, like Tanya Autry, Dr. Portia Moore. There were several other guests that we had, Gretchen Jennings, who came on board to really help us like dig for why we had to do a fund, especially a fund in a field where, at least myself as a person who grew up poor, in a field where you're not supposed to really talk about money or how you're working class or how you are literally making a living with your museum wage. So it really has felt like a manifesto. And in terms of the writing, and I'm just going to say this and actually let Kate, who was part of the writing team, is that in our collective group, people have such different strengths. And one of the biggest strengths in our group is that we have several writers and several academics, which is really like they took the bulk of that writing, right? So we had all these sessions of discussion and they put it down on paper, and it's kind of extraordinary that happened.
Yeah, thank you, Paula. And for folks who may not have seen the article, I think Gwen just threw a link into the chat. Yeah, Paula, I agree. I was going back over rereading this article for probably the first time since it came out, and I found myself just so proud of us for putting it together as a group and just thankful that we wrote this to document kind of the thinking and collaboration behind this first year, because we're coming up on a year since we first started talking about this project, this mutual aid fund for museum workers. And something I really appreciate about this article we wrote is that we put it in the context of the existing massive inequities and labor issues within the museum field. So we begin by saying that the field was in crisis before 2020, and I think that's probably obvious to most of us, but These are longstanding issues that were only brought into greater relief by the mass layoffs and the furloughs and the mistreatment of workers and the lack of protections that the pandemic brought. So there is a need here to address problems that go much deeper than just, making $500 payments to individual museum workers who need it, although we feel that work is important too. So the article kind of goes into that context of what does mutual aid mean in opposition to capitalism, and how are museums entrenched in this system of capitalism? What would it look like to remake that relationship and to pull away from the existing funding structures and ways of operating? And we end the article by talking about the radical futures that museum workers have envisioned, because we asked a set of questions, qualitative questions of applicants to the fund, such as, what is your dream for museums? What do you envision museums looking like in the future? And we received a range of really inspiring responses. We saw that people are really committed to museums, even if we don't agree with the form that they currently take. People are very passionate, and we also see a need for radical change for sure. So at the risk of summarizing the whole article, I'll just end it there. So I let some other folks talk.
Thank you both so much. As always, Museum Workers Speak coming in with very thorough and very exciting information. So thank you both so much. And I think we're going to circle back to talk to you, but I also want to pose this question to Joe and Jason. Could you tell us a little bit about what you decided to write in Viewfinder, and that will be kind of debuting when our next issue comes out? It's a lot of pointing.
As we spend 5 minutes deferring to one another, that might give you some insight into what our collaborative writing experience was like with our crew. You go first. No, you go first. So what we wrote about is we came into the Viewfinder process really just trying to have have it be a space where we could be honest and transparent about our experiences, our aspirations, our frustrations with things happening at our home museum, which is the Smart Museum, which has a lot of complications because of, we've had a revolving door director. We're at the University of Chicago. We're on the south side of Chicago. There's just all these different contexts and complications, and then sort of where we as museum educators sit within that institution and what we want for the field and for our students. So it was a lot to unpack, which is to say that each of us took a thread and ran in different directions. So Joe can tell you about hers, but some of the other, subjects, topics, themes that sort of arose in the other contributions were sort of about language, right? And sort of what does it mean to have an overture toward sort of inclusive language? In this case, this article is specifically about sort of Spanish language, right? And sort of does it just a direct translation, or is it fall short, or how do you change? To sort of what is called upon from the institution. If you're going to have Black educators and Black students, is there a remuneration? Is there compensation that sort of is adequate to the learning that happens there, separate from what a white educator could do? And we're saying, there's 7 different contributions, so there's 7 different themes. So we tried to pack a lot in, and I think originally Hallie and Sarah were very kind to say 3,000 or 4,000 words, and then we gave them about 18,000, and they were such beautiful editors that we pared it down somewhere around 7 or 8. So if you have a huge cup of coffee and a weekend, please try to make it through our essay when it comes out. But Joe can tell you much more about her brilliant and beautiful contribution that I think kicked it off and inspired all the rest of us.
Well, from my thread that I wove through this particular article, I focused on the flip side of being a museum educator, and that is being a teaching artist in the Chicago public schools, and how the children are faring since we've had this massive change in the way we teach art. One of the things that we as teaching artists and educators had to do was learn how to navigate the technology and overcome some of the gaps of getting supplies and things to the students so that we could continue teaching the way we did. The other component was actually taking a step back and looking at what they needed now more than ever. Trauma exists everywhere. And for this particular period of time, these children being ripped away from, the stability of going to school, that routine, that ritual, was not good for some of them. And it took a while for them to adjust. I think we started out pretty well. We'd have at least half of the class show up. Now we're getting, pretty much 2/3 to 3/4 of the class showing up each time. The children themselves have learned to take on caring roles with one another, checking in. Third graders are quite precocious. They've worked out a system of colors and numbers where a green means I'm happy and a 2 means I'm sad. And when they log into the class, they all list their numbers or colors. And if someone has a really, low number, everyone is like, what's wrong? Tell us. That kind of empathy and that kind of change is something that, gives me so much hope for, them becoming the next stewards of this world. They're amazing. And I can't say enough about them. And that's what I wrote about.
Thank you both so much. And Joe, I have to say that, like, and for everyone in attendance, this article is such a treat to read, just like the Museum Workers Speak one was. And I can't wait for you all to be able to read it. I just want to kick it over to Ashley for a quick second to just briefly summarize the topic of what you are writing about with your co-collaborator.
Sure. So Caitlin and I both believe that museum workers have an ethical responsibility to examine and critique, their collections, their spaces, and vision for public engagement, regardless of where you are, whether it's a big museum, small museum, medium museum, right? Like, we all, as a part of this particular system, have a responsibility to critique it, right? It's our responsibility to do so. And, just speaking what someone was saying earlier, right? It is incredibly possible. I'm telling you, it is possible to both love something and critique it at the same time. I know, wild. And so our article sort of speaks to that, right? It's possible to love something, but to also recognize when it causes or has caused historic harm to others. We work within the medium of portraiture, right, which is a really complicated history that's tied to elitism, it's tied to white supremacy. And, the article is essentially, specific examples from my work and from Caitlin's work. So Caitlin is the teen program specialist at the National Portrait Gallery. And my job is sort of a bridge between audience engagement and curatorial centered on women's history. And, it's just really sort of speaking to our experiences, and we've been able to use our collections and also speak to the gaps in our collections to really steer these conversations around elitism and white supremacy with our collections, right? That's a part of the critiquing, is actually using the collections to tell these stories and to really jumpstart these conversations. And I think, one of the other things that I'll kind of talk a little bit about later is, museum workers who work in educational and public programs, really don't get the same level of recognition for their work as their curatorial counterparts do sometimes. And so, one of the reasons why we were so passionate about this article is that, it was a platform for us to really share our stories, but also claim our value at our institution, right? This idea of, sometimes people who work in these particular areas really don't get the credit that they deserve, for being able to really push the envelope in terms of not just educating, but creating dialogue, right, with our audiences about these particular issues. And so, it was really important to us to really solidify, like, this is what ed and public programs have been doing, but like also will continue to do as well. So.
And Ashley, that's like such a great point to kind of go into my next question for all of you. Especially for the 13th issue, we were really talking about the change that's happening at our institutions, and how that has kind of started. I'd be kind of curious to hear from any one of our authors, and you guys can all jostle around about who's going to speak first. But what calls for change are you still making and advocating for at this time? And in writing your articles, where did change happen? I think especially for our Museum Workers Speak folks, it would be nice to hear an update of what you all been up to since then. So without giving you all a little bit of time, I'm going to start with the Smart Museum, and then maybe we'll kick it over to Museum Workers. We'll do Ashley and then Museum Workers Speak.
No, I will. We started, like just jumping in and challenging the status quo. We have the Smart Idea Committee, which is inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, which meets, we were meeting weekly. We meet every other week now, as we are ramping up to get the full cohort of museum workers at the Smart enrolled in sensitivity, diversity, equitability training, so that we can make a difference, that we can spearhead that change, because it does start with the individual. And we all are trying to get on that same page. We've been fortunate to have leadership, interim leadership, that has been very responsive to our needs, to the point that the university is looking for a new director for our museum, and they are listening to our input. We have told them what we expect, what we need, what we want, and whether or not all of it will be honored, at least they're listening. And that's the first step. So some changes are happening. Jason?
Yeah, if I can just build on that for a second, is to say that, this is marking 1 year since sort of lockdown started, which I think was the fulcrum or the sort of instigating incident for a lot of what this change that we're talking about throughout the issue has been. And then we're all sort of just muddling along with that when sort of the dam broke through following George Floyd's murder, right? And then suddenly the leadership was responsive and like, oh, well, maybe we should have our BIPOC staff sort of like involved in conversations. But I bring that up to say in terms of timing, because the budget for this past year was already set at that point, right? And we've been sort of like reworking it and just cobbling it together this last year as sort of like the pandemic and everything has sort of continued on. But to say in this moment right now, we are in the midst of budget plannings in a considered way for the following year, right? So in terms of like real change, this is the moment where leadership and the university can sort of go from being that supportive voice to being actively involved in putting literally their money where their mouth is, right? So that as we shift around really what the whole budget even looks like, what are the budget lines, what are the categories, who's involved with that? What does that mean for employment at the museum, right? Does it go from part-time temporary status to part-time permanent or to full-time status, and what sort of commitments and sort of real structures can we build at this moment that would demonstrate that someone, because I think the budget, it's not sexy, but that's where you tell the story of an organization. And that's what can drive things, right? Because one of the things we've heard this whole last year is like, we totally get you. We totally hear you. It's just, like our budgets have been slashed. And so now is the moment to say, okay, well, what is the budget and how are we going to allocate resource and time and worth and value across the museum? So I don't know, I guess we'll check back in 3 months and sort of let you know how it goes, but we're at least advocating for that. Yeah, we hear exactly, Karen. Yep. Sorry, go ahead, Ashley. Your budget is your value statement. Exactly. Yeah. And I think that, thank you. I'm going to actually share that in a memo this afternoon. Then that's a great statement. Thank you, Gwen.
I'm not going to give the entire article away because we want y'all to read it. But I think, so Caitlin is the teen programs specialist at the National Portrait Gallery. And so a lot of what she discusses is her work with our Teen Museum Advisory Council, which is a group of teens from the DMV area, DC, Maryland, Virginia area, who meet weekly to not just sort of have conversations about, what's happening in the museum and the collection. It's really an opportunity for the teens to, voice their concerns, right, about what it is that they see and what they don't see. But also, their experiences within the museum, right? And to also create programs and opportunities for them to engage with our visitors. And one of the biggest things that the Teen Museum Council does is the teen portrait competition, which happens every 3 years, or actually, no, it's been on a weird timeline, but the last one was in 2019. And so basically the teens examined all of the entries, they evaluated the work, and all of the submissions, and they're the ones who voted on the winners of the teen portrait competition. What's really important about the teen portrait competition is that, I work at a museum where it's greatest hits, right? Like the National Portrait Gallery is the museum of history's greatest hits, right? You go in there, there's presidents, there's, people that you recognize. But what's so important about the teen portrait competition is that it focuses on the everyday, right? It focuses on people who may not ever have their portrait at a museum, right? It's an opportunity for us to really expand the conversation of what we're going to be talking about, the history of the United States, right? The history of the United States isn't just George Washington, right? Or even Rosa Parks, right? It's also the people in your neighborhood. It's the people who go to your school, right? And so really figuring out ways to expand this conversation, and to really think more deeply about what it is that we collect, but also whose stories we're collecting to as well. And I work for a pan-institutional initiative, the Women's History Initiative, and so a really big part of my work is modeling behaviors, right? And building bridges and connecting with different curators and educators and other museum workers across the Smithsonian. And so the example that I sort of pointed to in my article is being a part of our Asia Pacific American Centers We Are Not a Stereotype series. And using a racist caricature of Queen Liliuokalani to have a conversation about trauma-informed teaching. And so really sort of pushing the boundaries of what, because usually it's like, what do you see? How does it make you feel when you're looking at an image, right? What do you notice, right? And really sort of digging more into conversations about, yes, how do you feel? But like, also, not just how do you feel, but how does this person inside this image feel, right? Like thinking about the historic context of our objects and getting people to understand language, particularly in terms of racial and gender and all those things in between. So really taking the opportunity to use our collections and building bridges across the Smithsonian, right? And really allowing the historians and curators and the educators to come together to sort of build a bigger picture as to why these images are so important, but also what we can learn from them.
Thank you so much, Jason and Ashley and Joe, to kind of kick us off. And then for Paula and Kate, you all have had a little bit of time between your article coming out and this conversation. So what's been shaken for Museum Workers Speak since the article?
So the subject of change and also accountability has been, I think, a tough discussion for all of us collectively, because so we're a group of almost half a dozen people. So we're all at different, like a spectrum of like, we need to burn everything down, everything's corrupt, to to, you know, people who still believe that change can come within from the inside, right? So me personally, it's just in the way that we have talked about our project and the amount of money we've raised and the way that we've positioned ourselves. For me, it truly, I have not looked towards institutions to change their minds about the way they run things. For me, and for others, you know, and now like Kate and also Gwen, who's here, chime in, but for me, it's about like, how do we realize and step into our power as museum workers together and truly build a community, build a mutual aid network, build a space where we can rely on each other and not wait for anyone else to do anything for us, because they won't. So that's really where I approach this, you know, and I think that's why I feel like this work is so separate from my day job, because my day job, I do my institutional things. And the mutual aid work truly is like, oh, well, what are other museum workers needing right now? And how can we find each other to do that work? And I would say that that's really where we're moving towards, like, how do we find each other to do the work we need to do? I've also been so heartened by the swell of mutual aid groups and also the unionizing that has happened. So while we're not necessarily the people, you know, we're not forming a museum workers union, although, you know, maybe, I don't know, that's a thought. I think that that collective strength is visible, probably more than in my time in this field, which has been like almost 15 years. But yeah, I think that's kind of my initial thoughts on that. And I don't know if Kate or even Gwen, who's a double agent, has thoughts on.
Yeah, I totally agree, Paula. And I just want to say, I want to take this opportunity to thank you and everyone else in Museum Workers Speak, the co-authors of our article, Anissa, Alyssa, Hannah, and our double agent, Gwen, for really pushing and expanding my personal thinking around this. You know, I've been thinking and talking about these problems with museum labor for several years, but I think the process of launching this fund and writing this article and like trying to think about our coherent kind of purpose as a group has really pushed me to connect the dots between, you know, the museum field and labor more broadly, you know, the conditions under which we are working as workers, and the solutions. You know, I think Paula highlighted a really important kind of dichotomy or sort of like conflicting urge, which is we want to speak to, or we would like to make change at the institutional level, which would presumably require speaking to leadership or changing the minds of those in power. But that doesn't seem to be something that's very effective. It's something, it's a real slog to try to get to people in power and to change their minds. So then the other prong of it is organizing and building collective power as workers. And that, I think, is the direction that we've moved in this year with the fund and with all of the sort of concurrent conversations and efforts around that. You know, we are talking a lot about building community and educating each other politically. And we had a recent, we collaborated with Museums and Race on a tweet chat recently that was really powerful. And a lot of what came out of that, a lot of the energy that came out of that was really about collective organizing, you know, whether that means literally unionizing within institutions or building power as museum workers across the sector. So that is kind of where my focus is turning these days.
Thank you. And honestly, thank you again to all of our authors for giving such thorough and exciting updates about like the work that they've been doing and the work that is still to come in terms of the changes at their institutions or within their organizations that they're pushing for other institutions. I also want to take a moment here to open the floor to the audience to ask questions, just so you can ask the authors themselves what's been going on. So please feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can put it in the chat and I'm happy to kind of read it aloud and get it out to the right people. This is that hot museum ed moment where you're sitting in silence and you're like, everyone's watching each other.
I can throw in a question
I love that.
if others feel shy. I think something that's interesting is all of you wrote collaborative articles, and you mentioned it as you were talking about your contributions to Viewfinder, but I'm curious if anybody wants to share more about the how the collaborative writing process went for you all and what you learned from that process.
Someone still has to take the lead on the writing, even if, so someone still has to take the lead on the writing, and the collaboration really comes in then massaging, big portions of it. And, I like to do more of the editing for ideas. And I know Kate is such a whiz at copy editing and really wordsmithing things. But people still have to take the lead on it. I think that's what's hard for us collectively, where it's like, well, we all want to do it, but it has to be someone's thing that they shepherd kind of through the stage.
Yeah, it does help to have a sort of project manager, at the risk of getting overly structured. And I would say something that was really helpful for writing this article for Viewfinder was we had a series of working sessions where we were literally all, I think this was probably after the first draft had been cobbled together, but we spent so much time on calls together in the document in Google Docs, just going over paragraph by paragraph and kind of discussing in real time how we felt things needed to be tweaked. And those conversations were so generative. I almost wish that we had recorded those and added those to our documentation, because that was really where we sharpened our ideas.
Maybe we should do that as a Viewfinder feature, like the collaborative conversations behind the stories.
That'd be so fun.
Yeah, my experience was pretty interesting, and I would love if the other contributors would join in. Sort of our process was a bit interesting, where so Caitlin and I collaborated on the project. We also had a number of eyes at our institution looking over the piece. So it was this really interesting experience where we have the editors at Viewfinder, and then we have people at our own institution that are looking at the piece too as well. So it was quite a journey in sort of to getting from point A to point B, especially having folks who are not necessarily in education or public programs take a look at our piece, who may not have been able to understand some of the points that we were making or why we were making them. But it was quite the experience, right? And because I work at this massive thing, there's always sort of this idea about representation and responsibility in terms of public output. And so it created a very, very interesting experience. But I think, I love collaborative work, because sometimes it's important because people will show you stuff that you can't see yourself because you're so into whatever it is that you're doing. But I do think that, you know, there is this really weird component, you know, when, you know, you're producing scholarly output and have 1,000 eyes on it at the same time.
I think this is where we're supposed to pop in and say like that we also wrangled and struggled with it, which we did for most of the contributions. So I'll say that Joe's was just sort of knocked out of the park on the first draft because she's a writer. So then all of the feedback from the Viewfinder editors and the rest of us were like, it's great. What if you just took this one half sentence out, and just because it needs to be shorter. So we didn't have a lot of chance to edit Joe's, but for the rest of us who are not such talented writers, it was a little bit of a back and forth and trying to figure out both our ideas, but then also the language to put it in, because we're not writers. So we had to sort of help each other along. And Hallie and Sarah were amazing in that. And I think, you know, I also feeling fortunate. We had a lot of working sessions through Zoom as well, but also just Google Docs. Like, what a savior is that, right? To be able to just sort of like put your comments in and sort of in real time develop something together. That's amazing, you know, rather than sort of sharing drafts of things. Yeah.
Well, what Jason failed to mention was that before I submitted my portion to the group contribution, I had edited the heck out of it. I think I had gone over, I mean, down to the word. Do I want to choose this word as opposed to that? So I do a lot of that with the things that I write, even in email. And it can slow things down, but this went surprisingly quick. And I think it's because of the passion that all of us were contributing to this, that we wanted it to be there, and we wanted to be there for it, to be present, to get it done, to get it knocked out, so that all of the various themes sort of like fed one into the other, all of those threads woven into a fabric that made a complete garment. And that's what we created. Can we do it again? Yeah, because we've got that process down now.
And I'll just jump in and say, Jason saying that you weren't all writers, but I think something that is so beautiful about that essay, that article, is that there's like 7 very distinct different voices. And it was really exciting to work on an article with so many different perspectives that were each preserved as your own individual perspectives and your own individual learnings. And I thought all of it was really beautifully written also. But really interesting to think about collaboration in writing in that way. I think we often think about it as like one article that where lots of people have joined into one voice, but it's nice to think about it from the opposite perspective too, with multiple voices in dialogue.
And Jason did an excellent job tying all of those themes together for us. He's a master tailor.
Master Taylor. I'm seeing a question from Kelly, which I was also curious about. So Kelly is saying, Ashley, it sounds like your institution requested an extensive review process. I'm curious about who reviewed your writing. Did it extend into curatorial or other departments? And if so, does education review their writing as well? Ooh, good question.
Yeah.
And did that happen to others on the call? Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And so one of the things that we realized, like I said in the beginning, you know, there's this sort of difference in how curatorial folks are treated versus ed folks. And one of the things is this process, right? There was no process for reviewing writing until we told them we were writing an article. And so what ended up happening was, and we didn't realize that, right? And my background is I'm a former academic librarian and archivist. So I'm not used to an extensive like internal review process. I'm used to literally just sending it to the editors, right, and having them review my stuff. I'm not used to having an internal review process. I'm used to being like, oh, I'm doing this thing, cool, right? And so this was a really different experience where, so both of our supervisors had to take a look. We have in-house editors, because we write publications for the museum. And then we had curators look at the piece too as well. So we ended up having 6 different people internally look at our piece, and then the folks over at Viewfinder. But what this did was it sort of forced our department to actually create a process for if educators do want to publish. It's something that I'm still sort of grappling with right now on a personal level, right? This lack of process or the lack of existence of a process. But I mean, this is one of the things about change, right? Is that sometimes these things have to happen to create change within a system. But I think one of the, like I said, one of the really interesting parts was, really having in-depth conversations with folks about the connections between curatorial and education, but also the fact that, they serve different purposes, right? And so it's really important to recognize sort of what each one does individually. There might be similarities, but, for us, it's not sometimes we're not about we have to remind folks that, sometimes people can't always physically come to the museum, right? So a big part of the educator's work is spreading that knowledge, disseminating that information, which is something curatorial doesn't always do. And so I think we really had to reiterate that, like, we are working together, but a part of our job is to really, the conversations that are on the wall, but really it's our job to bring it to as large of an audience as possible. And that's a very different skill set. And so just sort of really making that clear.
Absolutely. And what an intense editorial process. Like, honestly, I'm like sitting here thinking about it. I'm like, oh gosh, but it makes complete sense. And I'm so glad that you all do have something like in place to do that. Hallie?
Oh, I was just going to jump in and say, I hope that you are also asked to review curatorial articles or essays. No.
Well,
I think maybe that's a good place to wrap it up. Not that note of not being able to review curatorials, but just thinking about ways that writing can be a form of sharing educational expertise and hopefully sharing it beyond your department. Ideally not with like strict review processes that don't trust your writing or seek to review your writing, but as a way to kind of share all of our expertise and knowledge with others beyond our department. So I think with that, I'll say stay tuned for Viewfinder 13 in the next few weeks. And also stay tuned for future calls for submissions to Viewfinder. And also we may be recruiting editors in the not too distant future. So stay tuned for that as well. And Gwen, is there anything else that you want to wrap things up with?
Thank you. I just want to again say thank you to everybody on our panel today and to our amazing Viewfinder team. I hope, among other things, that this may have inspired those on the call or those watching this video to consider submitting your own article for future issues of Viewfinder. It's just a really wonderful personal practice, but also brings so much to our field in publishing these articles. We are going to, we talked ahead of time, since those of you who registered today, will send you a little email as soon as that new issue comes out, so you'll have a sneak peek. But also please follow the NAEA Twitter and Facebook. We'll be sharing all of this work there as well. I'm going to drop a link to our YouTube page where you can watch past issues of Peer2Peer. This is a monthly program. We're in the process of organizing our spring Peer2Peer. So if you have a topic that you'd really love us to see happen in the space, please feel free to reach out, let us know. And again, thank you all so much. Take care. Oh, and Paul is saying, look out for more from Museum Workers Speak this week. All right, take care, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.